In the early 1920s, the Osage Nation in Oklahoma was the richest population in the world per capita. Thanks to the oil found beneath their lands, their families lived in mansions and drove luxury cars. But that wealth came at a cost: blood. Suddenly, the Osage began to die. Not from illness, but from shootings, poisoning, and car bombings. Local authorities didn't seem to care, because they were implicated. This is the story of one of the darkest chapters in American history. A massive conspiracy of greed and murder that gave rise to the FBI, the Osage Murders. The morning air should have carried the sweet scent of prairie grass and wildflowers. Instead, it reeked of crude oil and something else. Something metallic. Something that made your stomach turn and your hands shake when you tried to light your morning cigarette. The Osage had become the wealthiest people per capita in the world almost overnight. Oil, black gold, the kind of money that could buy anything, including silence, including death, including the twisted loyalty of those who smiled at your dinner table while calculating how much your headright was worth. But here's what the history books won't tell you about the Osage Murders. The newspapers called it the Reign of Terror, but that makes it sound random, chaotic. It wasn't random at all. Every death was calculated, every explosion perfectly timed, every poisoning meticulously planned. This wasn't a crime spree. This was a systematic campaign of extermination disguised as isolated incidents. And the most terrifying part? The people orchestrating it weren't outsiders. They weren't strangers lurking in the shadows. They were neighbors, family members, trusted friends who had been planning this for years, watching and waiting and learning exactly how to make an entire people disappear. My name is irrelevant to this story, but my obsession with it isn't. I've spent the last 3 years digging through archives that most people don't even know exist. Court documents that were sealed for decades. FBI files that paint a picture so disturbing, so methodically evil, that you'll question everything you thought you knew about American justice. Because what happened to the Osage wasn't just murder. It was the blueprint for how wealth could be systematically stolen from an entire community through terror. And the methods used? They're still being used today. The year was 1921, and if you were driving through Osage County, Oklahoma, you might have thought you'd stumbled into some kind of fever dream. Massive mansions sprouting from the prairie like architectural mushrooms. Osage families driving Pierce Arrows and Cadillacs down dirt roads that connected to nothing but more oil derricks. Children attending boarding schools that cost more than most people made in a lifetime. The Osage Nation had negotiated something unprecedented in American history. When they were forced to relocate to this seemingly worthless stretch of Oklahoma territory, they retained the mineral rights to their land. Every drop of oil, every cubic foot of natural gas, every ounce of anything valuable that came out of the ground belonged to them collectively. And then the oil boom hit like a biblical flood. Suddenly, every enrolled member of the Osage Nation was receiving quarterly payments that dwarfed the salaries of doctors and lawyers. A single headright, the share each tribal member owned of the mineral wealth, was generating $25,000 a year. In 1920s money, that's roughly $400,000 annually in today's economy, per person, including children. The Osage had accidentally become the wealthiest people in America, and almost immediately, people began dying. Anna Brown was found shot in the back of the head in May 1921. Her body dumped in a ravine like discarded trash. Anna was young, beautiful, and worth a fortune. Her headright alone was generating enough money to buy a small town. 3 weeks later, her mother, Lizzie Kyle, died mysteriously of what the local doctor called a peculiar wasting illness. Symptoms that looked suspiciously like poisoning, though no one seemed particularly interested in investigating. Then Anna's sister, Rita Smith and Rita's husband William were killed when their house exploded in the middle of the night. The blast was so powerful it shattered windows 3 miles away. The official cause? A gas leak. How convenient. In 18 months, 24 Osage had died under mysterious circumstances. Heart attacks in healthy young people. Car accidents on straight roads in perfect weather. Sudden illnesses that struck without warning and killed within days. But here's what makes this story truly horrific. It wasn't the work of some deranged serial killer or random violence. Every death served a specific financial purpose. Every victim had been carefully selected based on their headright value and who would inherit when they died. The murders followed a pattern so precise, so coldly calculated, that it could only have been orchestrated by someone with intimate knowledge of Osage family structures, tribal law, and inheritance customs. Someone who had spent years studying exactly how to profit from death. And that someone had a name. William King Hale. To his friends and neighbors, Hale was the picture of respectability. A successful cattleman, a pillar of the community, a man who had built his fortune through hard work and shrewd business dealings. He owned vast ranches, employed dozens of workers, and was known for his generous donations to local churches and charities. He was also systematically murdering the Osage for their oil money. But Hale didn't get his hands dirty. He was far too smart for that. Instead, he cultivated a network of accomplices, each playing a specific role in what amounted to a murder-for-profit enterprise that operated with the efficiency of a corporation. There was the local doctor who would certify convenient causes of death without asking inconvenient questions. The sheriff who would conduct perfunctory investigations that never quite seemed to lead anywhere. The lawyer who would handle inheritance paperwork with suspicious speed and efficiency. And then there were the actual killers. Men like John Ramsey, who specialized in making murders look like accidents. Ernest Burkhart, who had married into an Osage family specifically to gain access to head rights. Byron Burkhart, who could poison someone slowly enough that their death would appear natural. What Hale had created was something unprecedented in American criminal history. A murder syndicate that operated in plain sight, protected by a web of corruption that reached into every level of local government and law enforcement. The beauty of the scheme, from Hale's perspective, was its apparent respectability. He wasn't some outlaw robbing banks or rustling cattle. He was a businessman maximizing his investments. The fact that those investments happened to be human lives was simply the cost of doing business. And for years, it worked perfectly. The local authorities either couldn't or wouldn't investigate the deaths seriously. The state government was either unaware or uninterested. The federal government had no jurisdiction unless specifically invited by local officials who had no intention of issuing such invitations. The Osage themselves knew exactly what was happening. They could see the pattern that everyone else seemed determined to ignore. Families were being systematically eliminated, always in ways that ensured their headrights would pass to non-Osage guardians or spouses who were part of Hale's network. But knowing and proving are two different things, especially when the very people who should have been investigating the crimes were the ones committing them. The Osage began taking their own precautions. Some hired private bodyguards. Others moved to distant cities, abandoning their homes and communities in hopes of staying alive. A few tried to give away their headrights or transfer them to relatives outside Oklahoma. Nothing worked. The murders continued with clockwork precision. By 1925, the situation had become so desperate that tribal leaders did something unprecedented. They bypassed local and state authorities entirely and went straight to Washington, demanding federal intervention. What they got was a young FBI agent named Tom White, and a federal investigation that would uncover one of the most elaborate and coldly calculated murder conspiracies in American history. but even federal involvement couldn't save everyone. The killing continued even as the investigation began, as if Hale and his accomplices were determined to eliminate as many witnesses as possible before the walls closed in. What Tom White discovered in Osage County would fundamentally change how America understood organized crime. This wasn't random violence or crimes of passion. This was systematic genocide motivated by greed, executed with corporate efficiency, and protected by institutional corruption. The methods Hale used to eliminate the Osage were as varied as they were horrific. Shootings made to look like hunting accidents, poisonings that mimicked natural illnesses, explosions disguised as gas leaks, car crashes on roads that had been mysteriously damaged just before the victims' routine drives. But the most chilling aspect wasn't the murders themselves. It was the systematic way Hale had infiltrated Osage families through marriage and friendship, gaining their trust even as he planned their deaths. Ernest Burkhart didn't just marry Molly Kyle because he loved her. He married her because Hale had identified her family as high-value targets and needed someone on the inside to monitor their movements and report on their daily routines. The local doctor who certified so many convenient deaths wasn't just incompetent or careless. He was a paid participant in a murder conspiracy that required medical cover to succeed. The sheriff who conducted such superficial investigations wasn't just lazy or overwhelmed. He was actively protecting the killers by ensuring their crimes would never be properly investigated. This was corruption on a scale that most people simply couldn't comprehend. An entire community's power structure had been co-opted to serve a single purpose: the systematic elimination of the Osage people for their mineral wealth. And it might have succeeded completely if not for one crucial miscalculation. William Hale had assumed that the federal government would remain as indifferent to Osage deaths as local authorities had been. He believed that his network of corruption was so complete, so deeply embedded in the fabric of Oklahoma society, that no outside force could penetrate it. He was wrong. The FBI investigation that began in 1925 would eventually expose not just the murders themselves, but the entire system of institutional corruption that had made them possible. What Tom White and his team uncovered was so shocking, so comprehensive in its evil, that it would change federal law enforcement forever. But the investigation came too late for dozens of victims. By the time federal agents arrived in Osage County, entire family lines had been eliminated. Children had been orphaned and their inheritances stolen. A community that had survived removal, forced relocation, and cultural suppression was being systematically destroyed by the very wealth that should have secured their future. The story of what happened next, how the investigation unfolded, and what it revealed about the true scope of the conspiracy is where our journey into America's darkest secret truly begins. Because what the FBI discovered in Oklahoma wasn't just a local crime spree. It was a template for how systematic oppression could be disguised as isolated incidents, how genocide could be rebranded as unfortunate accidents, and how an entire people could be made to disappear while the world looked the other way. And as we'll see, the methods pioneered in Osage County didn't die with William Hale's conviction. What happens when justice itself becomes the weapon of the oppressor? When the very institutions designed to protect the innocent become the architects of their destruction? The investigation that Tom White launched in Osage County should have been straightforward. Follow the evidence, interview the witnesses, build the case, arrest the perpetrators. But White quickly discovered something that made his blood run cold in those sweltering Oklahoma nights. The evidence had been systematically destroyed. The witnesses were either dead or too terrified to speak. And the perpetrators weren't hiding in shadows or operating from criminal undergrounds. They were running the county. Picture this. You're a federal agent in 1925, walking into a community where the sheriff greets you with a smile and offers to help with your investigation, knowing full well that he's been covering up murders for years. Where the local doctor invites you to dinner and asks about your family, while his medicine bag contains enough poison to kill half the reservation. Where the most respected businessman in town offers to provide horses for your investigation team, even though he's the one orchestrating the killings. This wasn't just corruption. This was psychological warfare disguised as hospitality. White's first breakthrough came not from brilliant detective work, but from something far more disturbing. The killers had grown so confident, so certain of their immunity, that they had begun to document their crimes. Ernest Burkhart, William Hale's nephew and the husband of Molly Kyle, had been keeping detailed records. Not because he was planning to confess or turn evidence, because Hale demanded accounting. The murder conspiracy was being run like a business, complete with profit and loss statements calculated in human lives. The records White discovered revealed the true scope of what had been happening in Osage County. This wasn't 24 random murders over 18 months. This was a coordinated campaign involving dozens of participants, hundreds of thousands of dollars in payments, and a level of planning that suggested years of preparation. Hale had identified every major Osage family and mapped their inheritance patterns. He knew which deaths would consolidate the most head rights into the fewest hands. He knew which victims had made wills and which relied on tribal inheritance law. He knew exactly how long to wait between killings to avoid suspicion, and precisely how to time murders to maximize financial returns. But the most chilling discovery in Burkhart's records wasn't the cold calculation of the murders themselves. It was the recruitment notes. Detailed psychological profiles of potential accomplices, analyzing their weaknesses, their debts, their fears, and their moral flexibility. Hale hadn't just assembled a murder syndicate. He had conducted a comprehensive study of human nature and identified exactly the type of people who could be convinced to kill for money. The local sheriff, for instance, had been recruited not because he was particularly corrupt, but because he was drowning in gambling debts and desperate enough to rationalize anything. The doctor had been brought in not because he was evil, but because his medical practice was failing and he couldn't afford to lose his house. Each accomplice had been carefully selected based on their specific vulnerabilities and given just enough information to perform their role without understanding the full scope of the operation. It was compartmentalized evil, designed to prevent any single participant from grasping the magnitude of what they were enabling. This level of organizational sophistication was unprecedented in American criminal history. Hale had essentially created the template for what would later be recognized as organized crime, decades before the mafia would gain national attention. But unlike traditional criminal organizations that operated outside the law, Hale's syndicate functioned as a shadow government, using legitimate institutions to commit illegitimate acts. The corruption wasn't separate from the system. It was the system. White's investigation team faced challenges that no law enforcement agency had ever encountered before. How do you investigate crimes when the local police are participants? How do you protect witnesses when the people threatening them wear badges? How do you gather evidence when the courts themselves are compromised? The answer was as innovative as it was dangerous. White began operating essentially as a counterintelligence agency, using techniques that wouldn't be formally adopted by federal law enforcement for decades. His agents posed as oil workers, cattlemen, and traveling salesmen. They established safe houses in neighboring counties and conducted interviews in secret locations. They developed codes for communication and created false identities for witnesses who agreed to cooperate. Most importantly, they began building parallel cases against the same individuals, so that even if local authorities sabotaged one investigation, others would continue. This wasn't traditional police work. This was warfare fought with subpoenas and search warrants instead of guns and explosives. And it was working. Slowly, Methodically, White's team began piecing together the true extent of Hale's operation. What they discovered was that the Osage murders were just the visible tip of a much larger criminal enterprise. Hale had been systematically defrauding Osage guardianships for years before the killing began, skimming money from accounts he was supposed to be managing in trust. When that proved insufficiently profitable, he had moved to more direct methods, arranging accidents for Osage who had grown suspicious of his financial management, facilitating suicides for tribal members who had threatened to report his embezzlement. The murder campaign that had terrorized the community wasn't a sudden outbreak of violence. It was the logical escalation of a systematic looting operation that had been going on for nearly a decade. But even as White's investigation progressed, the killing continued. Hale and his accomplices knew they were being watched, but they also knew that stopping would be tantamount to confession. So they kept murdering, even as federal agents documented their every move. The psychological impact on the Osage community was devastating. Families that had survived removal, forced assimilation, and decades of government neglect were being destroyed by the very prosperity that should have secured their future. Children were afraid to inherit from their parents, knowing that wealth was a death sentence. Adults were afraid to trust their neighbors, knowing that friendship could be a cover for murder. Elderly tribal members were afraid to die naturally, knowing that their deaths would trigger inheritance transfers that might get their survivors killed. The community was trapped in a nightmare where prosperity meant danger, where success invited death, and where the American dream had become an American horror story. And through it all, William Hale continued to present himself as a pillar of the community. He attended church services where he prayed alongside the families of his victims. He participated in community events where he expressed concern about the tragic accidents befalling his Osage neighbors. He even contributed money to reward funds for information about the murders he had ordered. The psychological cruelty of this performance was perhaps worse than the murders themselves. Hale wasn't just killing the Osage. He was forcing them to smile and shake hands with their executioner while pretending everything was normal. But Hale had made one crucial error in his psychological manipulation. He had underestimated Molly Kyle. Molly was Ernest Burkhart's wife, the sister of Anna Brown and Rita Smith, the daughter of Lizzie Kyle. She had watched her family systematically eliminated while her husband expressed sympathy and promised to help find the killers. What she didn't know was that Ernest was reporting her every move to his uncle, William Hale, and that her own husband was helping plan the deaths of her relatives, that the man sharing her bed was calculating the value of her headright and planning her eventual murder. But Molly was more observant than anyone realized. She had begun to notice patterns that others had missed. The way Ernest seemed to know about deaths before they were announced. The way he disappeared for hours without explanation. The way he seemed nervous whenever she asked questions about her family's misfortunes. Slowly, carefully, Molly Kyle began conducting her own investigation into her family's deaths. What she discovered would provide the key evidence that finally brought down William Hale's murder syndicate. But her investigation would also put her in mortal danger, because once Hale realized that Molly was onto him, she became the next target on his carefully planned list of eliminations. The final phase of the Osage murders was about to begin, and this time, the killers weren't just trying to steal headrights. They were trying to eliminate the one person who could expose the entire conspiracy. What happened next would determine not just whether justice would be served for the victims who had already died, but whether the systematic extermination of the Osage people would continue until none were left to tell their story. The investigation was about to become a race against time, with Molly Kyle's life hanging in the balance and the future of an entire nation at stake. And in the shadows of Osage County, William Hale was preparing for one final, desperate gamble that would either secure his empire of death forever or bring it crashing down around him. The question was simple. Would Molly Kyle live long enough to reveal the truth? Or would she become just another tragic accident in America's most successful genocide? The answer would reshape federal law enforcement, redefine the relationship between tribal nations and the United States government, and reveal truths about American society that many people weren't ready to confront. But first, Molly Kyle had to survive the night. What do you do when the person trying to save you is slowly poisoning you to death? Molly Kyle discovered this impossible truth on a February morning in 1926, when she found the medicine bottle hidden behind the flour jar in her kitchen pantry. The same bottle her loving husband Ernest had been bringing her every evening for months, along with gentle words about helping her stomach troubles and worried kisses on her forehead. The label was partially torn, but she could still make out enough letters to spell arsenic solution. Her hands shook as she held the bottle up to the morning light streaming through her kitchen window. The liquid inside moved like liquid mercury, thick and deliberate, catching the sun in ways that made her stomach lurch with recognition. This was why she'd been feeling so weak, why her hair had started falling out in clumps, why her teeth had begun to loosen, and her skin had taken on that gray pallor that made neighbors whisper about consumption. Ernest hadn't just been reporting her movements to his uncle William Hale. He had been slowly killing her. But here's what made Molly's situation even more terrifying than discovering your husband is poisoning you. She couldn't let him know that she knew, because the moment Ernest realized she had uncovered his method, he would switch to something faster, more direct, more final. So Molly Kyle began the most dangerous performance of her life. Every evening when Ernest returned home with her medicine, she would smile and thank him, and pretend to swallow the arsenic while secretly spitting it into her handkerchief. She would complain about her stomach troubles getting worse, because stopping the symptoms too quickly would raise suspicions. She would let him hold her while she pretended to sleep, feeling his breath on her neck and wondering which night he would decide that slow poisoning was taking too long. Meanwhile, Tom White's federal investigation was closing in on Hale's operation, but they needed living witnesses to testify. And Molly Kyle was the key to everything, because she was the only person who could connect Ernest Burkhart directly to the murders through his intimate knowledge of family movements and routines. But White's team faced an impossible dilemma. If they approached Molly directly, they would expose her to immediate danger. Hale's network of informants was so comprehensive that any contact with federal agents would be reported within hours. But if they didn't warn her about the poisoning, she might die before she could provide the testimony they needed. The solution they developed was as elegant as it was risky. Instead of contacting Molly directly, they began spreading carefully crafted rumors designed to reach her ears without seeming official. A conversation between two oil workers at the general store about how some husbands had been killing their wives with medicine that looked like stomach remedies. A discussion between women at church about how arsenic poisoning could mimic natural illness. Casual warnings about being careful with any medications that weren't prescribed by doctors from outside the county. The psychological warfare that Hale had been conducting against the Osage community was turned back on him. His own network of gossips and informants began spreading information that would help his victims protect themselves without realizing they were doing it. But Hale was too smart to be fooled for long. By spring of 1926, he had realized that federal agents were operating in his territory and that his carefully constructed murder syndicate was under investigation. His response was characteristically ruthless and methodical. Instead of panicking or fleeing, Hale accelerated his timeline. If he was going to be caught, he would eliminate as many witnesses as possible before that happened. The murders that had been spaced out over months to avoid suspicion now began happening weekly, then daily. Barney McBride, an Osage who had gone to Washington to demand federal investigation, was found beaten to death in a Maryland hotel room. W. W. Vaughn, a private investigator hired by Osage families, was thrown from a speeding train. Oil workers who had seen too much began having fatal accidents with suspicious frequency. But the most chilling escalation was what Hale planned for his own nephew's wife. Ernest Burkhart had been growing increasingly unstable as the federal investigation intensified. The psychological pressure of slowly poisoning his wife while pretending to love her had begun to crack his already fragile mental state. He was drinking heavily, talking too much, and showing signs that he might confess to save himself. From Hale's perspective, Ernest had become a liability, and Molly, with her intimate knowledge of Ernest's routines and access to family information, was an even bigger threat. The plan Hale developed was diabolical in its simplicity. Ernest would increase Molly's arsenic dosage until she became critically ill. Then, while she was hospitalized and helpless, she would suffer a heart attack that would be attributed to her ongoing illness. Ernest, the grieving widower, would inherit her head right and could be quietly eliminated later if he continued to pose problems. But Molly Kyle had spent months learning to read her husband's moods and behaviors. She could tell when he was nervous, when he was planning something, when he had received instructions from his uncle. And in early March 1926, she noticed that Ernest's behavior had changed in subtle but terrifying ways. He was being too solicitous, too caring, bringing her medicine more frequently, and insisting she take larger doses. He was asking questions about her will, about her preferences for funeral arrangements, about whether she wanted to be buried in traditional Osage clothing or contemporary dress. Most ominously, he had begun talking about taking a trip to visit his family in Texas, suggesting they should put their affairs in order before leaving. Molly realized that Ernest wasn't planning a vacation. He was planning her final elimination and his own escape. The trap was closing around her, and she had perhaps days, maybe hours, before Ernest's medicine reached lethal concentrations, or Hale decided that slower methods were taking too long. This was when Molly Kyle made the decision that would ultimately bring down the entire murder syndicate. She would have to trust someone completely, knowing that if she chose wrong, she would be dead within hours. The person she chose was her sister-in-law, Brian Burkhart's wife. Not because she was certain of the woman's loyalty, but because she was the only person close enough to the conspiracy to understand the danger while potentially still having enough humanity left to help. Late one night in March, while Ernest was meeting with Hale to discuss business, Molly crept across the yard to her sister-in-law's house and knocked softly on the kitchen door. When it opened, she was looking into the eyes of a woman who had been living with her own terrible knowledge. Brian Burkhart's wife had suspected for months that her husband was involved in the murders, but like Molly, she had been too terrified to act on her suspicions. The conversation that followed would change everything. Two women, both married to killers, both living with the daily terror of not knowing when they might become the next victims, finally breaking their silence and sharing what they knew. What they revealed to each other painted a picture of the conspiracy that was even more comprehensive and horrifying than Tom White's investigation had uncovered. The murders hadn't been limited to the Osage victims that made headlines. There had been dozens of other deaths, non-Osage people who had learned too much or asked too many questions, or simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Oil workers who had witnessed meetings between Hale and known criminals. Lawyers who had asked uncomfortable questions about inheritance procedures. Even a federal postal inspector who had been investigating irregularities in mail delivery to Osage households. Hale's operation had been eliminating anyone who posed even a potential threat, creating a climate of terror so pervasive that most people had learned to see nothing, hear nothing, and remember nothing that might put them in danger. But now, with federal agents actively investigating and local accomplices beginning to crack under pressure, Hale was preparing for what he called the final harvest. A coordinated series of eliminations that would remove every remaining witness and leave him with clear title to millions of dollars in Osage head rights. The list of targets was staggering. Not just Molly Kyle and the other surviving Osage who knew too much, but also the nervous accomplices who might turn state's evidence, the federal agents who were getting too close to the truth, and even some of Hale's own relatives who had become liabilities. William Hale was preparing to murder his way to complete immunity, and he had the resources, the network, and the ruthless determination to pull it off. Unless Molly Kyle could find a way to get her information to Tom White's investigation team without being discovered. The next 48 hours would determine whether the Osage murders would end with justice or with the complete elimination of everyone who could testify about what had really happened in those blood-soaked Oklahoma oil fields. And in a farmhouse outside Pawhuska, William Hale was cleaning his rifle and reviewing his final list of names, preparing to write the last chapter of America's most successful genocide. The race against time had begun, and Molly Kyle was running for her life with secrets that could topple an empire built on bones and oil money. But first, she had to survive long enough to tell them. The clock was ticking, and every second she delayed increased the chances that Ernest would notice her changed behavior, that Hale would accelerate his timeline, or that the federal investigation would be sabotaged by the same corruption that had enabled years of murder. What happened next would echo through American history for generations, changing how the federal government approached organized crime, how tribal nations protected their sovereignty, and how ordinary people understood the price of looking the other way when evil wore a familiar face. But in that moment, none of that mattered to Molly Kyle. All that mattered was making it through the night without her husband realizing that she knew he had been slowly poisoning her to death while whispering words of love in her ear. The most intimate betrayal in a conspiracy built on betrayals was about to be exposed, and the consequences would shatter more than just one criminal enterprise. They would shatter the comfortable illusions that allowed an entire community to participate in genocide while maintaining their sense of moral superiority. The reckoning was coming, and it would spare no one who had chosen silence over courage, profit over justice, or convenience over truth. But first, Molly Kyle had to live long enough to light the fuse that would bring it all crashing down. The sound that saved Molly Kyle's life wasn't her own voice calling for help. It wasn't the federal agents finally arriving to protect her. It wasn't even the confession that would eventually bring down William Hale's empire of death. It was the sound of her husband, Ernest, vomiting in the middle of the night, his body rejecting the same arsenic he had been feeding her for months. You see, Ernest Burkhart had made a crucial mistake in his murder methodology. In his growing paranoia about being discovered, he had begun testing each batch of poison on himself first, taking small doses to ensure the arsenic was still potent enough to kill. But arsenic is a cumulative poison. Each tiny taste was building up in his system, slowly destroying him from the inside while he destroyed his wife. The irony was poetic. The man who had been methodically poisoning the woman he claimed to love was accidentally poisoning himself in the process. But Ernest's midnight illness gave Molly something she desperately needed: time. While her husband was doubled over in agony, she slipped out of their bedroom and began the most dangerous walk of her life. The March night was moonless, which meant she could move unseen across the oil-soaked fields that separated her house from the nearest telephone. But it also meant she was navigating by memory through terrain that had been deliberately altered by Hale's men to prevent exactly this kind of escape. Hidden trenches disguised as natural erosion. Oil slicks that would send a running person sliding into the darkness. And somewhere out there, the night watchman who worked for Hale's operation, men whose job was to ensure that no Osage left their homes after dark without permission. Molly knew that making a phone call to federal authorities would be suicide unless she could do it without being traced. Every telephone operator in the county was either on Hale's payroll or too terrified to refuse his demands for information about who was calling whom. But there was one phone line that Hale hadn't thought to monitor: the emergency telephone at the oil company's main pumping station, installed for industrial accidents and connected directly to the company's headquarters in Tulsa. If Molly could reach that phone and convince someone in Tulsa to contact Tom White's investigation team, she might survive long enough to testify. But the pumping station was 3 miles away across open prairie, and she would have to get there and back before Ernest recovered enough to notice she was gone. The journey that followed was like something from a fever dream. Crawling through irrigation ditches filled with crude oil runoff, hiding behind equipment sheds while armed guards made their rounds, moving from shadow to shadow across a landscape that had been transformed from Osage homeland into an industrial wasteland designed to extract wealth while eliminating the people who owned it. When she finally reached the pumping station, Molly discovered that the telephone was locked inside a security cage. But years of watching oil workers had taught her something useful. The lock was designed to keep out casual thieves, not desperate women with intimate knowledge of how industrial equipment operated. Using a piece of metal pipe as a lever, she managed to pry open the cage just enough to reach the telephone. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely dial, and when the operator in Tulsa finally answered, Molly realized she had no idea what to say. How do you explain to a stranger that your husband has been poisoning you as part of a conspiracy to murder an entire tribal nation for their oil money? How do you make someone believe something so monstrous that it sounds like the ravings of a woman who has already been driven insane by arsenic? The conversation that followed lasted less than 3 minutes, but it changed everything. Because the operator in Tulsa wasn't just a telephone employee. She was the daughter of an oil executive who had been quietly investigating irregularities in Osage County lease payments. She knew enough about the situation to understand that Molly's desperate call wasn't delusional rambling. Within an hour, Tom White was receiving a coded telegram that simply read, "The flowers need immediate attention. Spring harvest in danger. Molly." White understood immediately. His team had been using flower metaphors in their communications, with Molly referring to their key witness who was in mortal danger. The message meant that Molly Kyle had discovered the immediate threat and needed federal protection before dawn. But protecting Molly without exposing the investigation required a level of coordination that had never been attempted in federal law enforcement. White's agents would have to extract her from her home without alerting Hale's surveillance network, while simultaneously gathering enough evidence to justify federal arrests. The operation that White launched that night was part rescue mission, part evidence gathering, and part psychological warfare designed to turn Hale's own methods against him. Instead of approaching Molly's house directly, federal agents began staging what appeared to be routine oil field inspections throughout Osage County. Teams of men in official-looking vehicles, carrying clipboards and measuring equipment, systematically visiting every major installation in the area. The beauty of the deception was its mundane nature. Oil field inspections were so common that Hale's lookouts barely paid attention to them. But each inspection team included armed federal agents who were actually mapping Hale's operation and identifying key participants in the conspiracy. Meanwhile, one team used the cover of inspecting Molly's neighborhood to make contact with her, but they couldn't simply knock on her door without alerting Ernest and potentially triggering an immediate murder attempt. Instead, they staged a gas leak emergency that required evacuating several houses in the area. In the confusion of neighbors being moved to safety while repair crews worked on the dangerous leak, federal agents were able to speak with Molly privately and confirm what they had suspected for months. Ernest Burkhart wasn't just an accomplice in his uncle's murder conspiracy. He was actively trying to kill his own wife while federal agents watched helplessly from a distance. The evidence Molly provided that night was devastating in its specificity. Names, dates, methods, financial records that Ernest had carelessly left where she could find them. Details about how the murders were planned, who carried them out, and how the inheritance transfers were managed afterward. But most importantly, Molly revealed something that Tom White's investigation had missed. The Osage murders weren't ending. They were accelerating toward a final phase that would eliminate every remaining witness and leave Hale with complete control over millions of dollars in oil revenues. Hale's final harvest was scheduled to begin within days, and it would start with the systematic elimination of everyone who could connect him to the conspiracy, including federal agents who had gotten too close to the truth. White realized that his investigation team wasn't just racing to solve a series of murders. They were trying to prevent their own assassinations while gathering evidence that could survive even if none of them lived to present it in court. The next 72 hours would determine whether the Osage murders ended with justice or with the complete success of America's most sophisticated genocide. But first, they had to keep Molly Kyle alive long enough to testify, which meant convincing Ernest Burkhart that his wife was still dying of natural causes while secretly providing her with medical treatment for arsenic poisoning. The psychological complexity of the situation was staggering. Molly would have to continue living with her would-be murderer, accepting his expressions of concern while federal agents worked to build a case that could save her life and bring down his uncle's empire. And Ernest, weakened by his own accidental arsenic consumption, would have to maintain the pretense of being a loving husband while reporting to Hale about his wife's condition and planning her final elimination. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose not just the murders themselves, but the entire system of corruption and complicity that had made them possible. A system that reached far beyond Oklahoma, involving federal officials, major oil companies, and financial institutions that had profited from what they knew was blood money. Because what Tom White's investigation was uncovering wasn't just a local crime spree. It was a prototype for how systematic oppression could be disguised as business as usual, how genocide could be rebranded as economic development, and how an entire nation could participate in atrocity while maintaining plausible deniability. The methods pioneered in Osage County would be refined and repeated throughout American history, wherever indigenous wealth attracted the attention of people who believed that murder was simply another business expense. But in March 1926, none of that mattered to Molly Kyle, as she lay in bed listening to her husband's labored breathing and wondering whether the federal agents would move fast enough to save her life. All that mattered was surviving until morning, without Ernest realizing that she knew about the arsenic, about the murders, about the conspiracy that had destroyed her family while wearing the mask of friendship and marriage and community concern. The most intimate betrayal in American criminal history was about to be exposed, and the reverberations would challenge everything the nation believed about justice, progress, and the price of looking away when evil wore a familiar face. But first, Molly Kyle had to make it through one more night of pretending to love the man who was slowly poisoning her to death. The clock beside her bed ticked toward dawn, each second bringing her closer to either salvation or her final dose of medicine, administered with a kiss and whispered promises of devotion. In the darkness outside her window, federal agents were preparing for the most complex arrest operation in American history, while William Hale cleaned his weapons and reviewed his list of final targets. The reckoning was 12 hours away, and it would spare no one who had chosen silence over courage, profit over justice, or convenience over truth. The sound of Ernest stirring in his sleep made Molly's heart race, but she forced herself to breathe steadily and maintain the pretense of natural slumber. Because if he woke up and saw the knowledge in her eyes, If he realized that she understood what he had been doing to her all these months, then all of Tom White's careful planning would be worthless. The most dangerous performance of her life was entering its final act, and the curtain was about to rise on a confrontation that would determine whether America's most successful genocide would finally face justice or continue until no Osage remained alive to tell their story. The morning light creeping through her bedroom window carried either the promise of liberation or the shadow of her own execution. In those final hours before dawn, while Molly Kyle counted her heartbeats and wondered if each one might be her last, something else was stirring in the darkness of Osage County, something that would make the horrors already uncovered seem almost quaint by comparison. The sound came first as a whisper through the oil derricks, a low, mechanical humming that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, as if the prairie had developed a voice and was trying to speak. Workers at the night shifts heard it around 3 a.m., that strange vibration that made their teeth ache and their hands shake as they tried to focus on their gauges and pressure readings. What they didn't know was that the sound was coming from beneath their feet, from a network of tunnels that William Hale had been constructing for over 2 years, using oil drilling equipment to create something that had nothing to do with petroleum extraction. Tom White's federal agents had discovered the entrance to this underground system during their covert surveillance operations, but what they found down there defied everything they thought they knew about the scope of Hale's criminal enterprise. This wasn't just a murder conspiracy. It was an infrastructure for industrial-scale elimination. The tunnels connected major Osage properties throughout the county, allowing Hale's men to move unseen beneath the landscape, emerging inside homes and businesses without ever being spotted by witnesses or security guards. But the tunnels served another, more chilling purpose. They were filled with explosives, not the crude dynamite that had been used to destroy the Smith house and make Rita's murder look like a gas leak accident. This was something far more sophisticated, a coordinated system of charges that could be detonated simultaneously to level every major Osage residence in the county within minutes. Hale's final harvest wasn't going to be a series of individual murders spread out over time to avoid suspicion. It was going to be a single night of coordinated destruction that would eliminate the entire Osage population in one carefully orchestrated catastrophe. The discovery of the tunnel system forced Tom White to confront a horrifying reality. Everything his investigation had uncovered so far, all the murders they had documented and the evidence they had gathered, represented only a fraction of what Hale had actually been planning. The man wasn't just a killer operating for financial gain. He was an architect of genocide who had spent years building the infrastructure necessary to eliminate an entire people while making it look like a series of tragic accidents. But the tunnels revealed something else that made White's blood run cold in those pre-dawn hours, as federal agents mapped the underground network by flashlight. The system wasn't designed just to kill the Osage. It was designed to kill anyone who might investigate their deaths. Charges had been placed beneath the courthouse where records were kept, beneath the telegraph office where communications with federal authorities were transmitted, beneath the hotel where White's team had been staying during their investigation. Hale had been planning to eliminate not just his victims, but also the entire infrastructure that might be used to investigate their deaths. He was going to murder the Osage and then destroy any possibility that justice could ever be served for their killings. The scope of the conspiracy was so vast, so comprehensive in its evil, that it challenged the fundamental assumptions about how organized crime operated in America. This wasn't just criminal enterprise. This was warfare conducted against American citizens by someone who had concluded that genocide was simply another business strategy. But Hale had made one crucial error in his underground preparations. The tunnels that were supposed to give him invisible access to his targets also gave federal agents invisible access to his operation. While Hale's men had been focused on placing explosives and monitoring Osage movements from below ground, they hadn't considered that their own activities could be observed from the same tunnels. Tom White's agents had been documenting everything, photographing the explosive placements, recording conversations between conspirators, and mapping the entire network of planned destruction. The evidence they gathered in those tunnels was unprecedented in American criminal history. Not just proof of murders that had been committed, but detailed documentation of a systematic campaign of extermination that was still in progress. More importantly, the tunnel system revealed the true scope of Hale's network of accomplices. This wasn't just a handful of corrupt local officials and desperate criminals. The underground infrastructure had required major construction equipment, specialized explosives, and coordination with mining engineers and demolition experts. The conspiracy involved dozens of people with technical expertise, all of whom had been recruited and paid to participate in what they knew was a campaign of mass murder. Hale hadn't just corrupted the local power structure. He had created an entirely parallel infrastructure dedicated to systematic elimination. But the most chilling discovery in the tunnels wasn't the explosives or the evidence of planning. It was the records that Hale's men had been keeping, detailed documentation of every Osage family's movements, schedules, and vulnerabilities. They knew which children attended which schools and what routes they took to get there. They knew which adults worked which shifts and what time they returned home. They knew which families had night guards and which relied on dogs for security. Most disturbing of all, they knew which federal agents were investigating what aspects of the case and where those agents were staying, what they were eating, and who they were talking to. Tom White realized that his investigation hadn't been operating in secret at all. Every move his team had made had been observed, documented, and incorporated into Hale's planning. The federal agents weren't just racing to solve the case before more Osage were killed. They were racing to solve it before they themselves were eliminated as part of Hale's final solution. The psychological impact of this discovery was devastating. White's team had to continue their investigation while knowing that their every action was being monitored by the very people they were trying to arrest. They had to protect witnesses while knowing that their safe houses had been compromised from the beginning. Most terrifyingly, they had to trust local contacts and informants while knowing that Hale's network was so comprehensive that anyone could be reporting their activities to the conspirators. But the tunnel discovery also provided White with something he had desperately needed, a way to turn Hale's own methods against him. If Hale's men could use the underground system to spy on their targets, then federal agents could use the same system to spy on the conspirators. The tunnels that were supposed to give Hale invisible access to his victims would give the FBI invisible access to his planning sessions. What followed was the most complex counterintelligence operation in American law enforcement history. Federal agents began using Hale's own tunnel system to conduct surveillance on his meetings, to photograph his records, and to document conversations that proved not just individual guilt, but the entire scope of the conspiracy. They discovered that Hale's final harvest was scheduled for the night of the spring equinox, a date that had been chosen for its symbolic significance. The elimination of the Osage would coincide with the traditional time of renewal and rebirth, a psychological gesture that revealed the depth of Hale's contempt for the people he was destroying. But the tunnels also revealed something that gave White's team hope. Hale's operation, for all its sophistication and planning, was beginning to fracture under the pressure of the federal investigation. Some of his accomplices were growing nervous about the scope of the planned destruction. Others were beginning to question whether mass murder was worth the financial rewards they had been promised. A few were even secretly considering whether they could save themselves by cooperating with federal authorities. The conspiracy that had seemed so monolithically evil was actually a collection of individuals, each with their own fears, doubts, and moral flexibility. And individuals could be turned, bargained with, convinced to choose survival over loyalty to a cause that was becoming increasingly dangerous for its own participants. White began a careful campaign to exploit these fractures, using information gathered from the tunnels to approach specific accomplices with evidence of their participation and offers of protection in exchange for testimony. But this psychological warfare had to be conducted with extreme care. If Hale realized that his tunnel system had been compromised, he might accelerate his timeline and trigger the mass destruction immediately, rather than risk losing his opportunity for revenge. The federal agents found themselves walking a tightrope between gathering evidence and preventing catastrophe, knowing that a single miscalculation could result in the immediate deaths of hundreds of innocent people. Meanwhile, Molly Kyle was still trapped in her bedroom, pretending to sleep while listening to her husband's labored breathing and wondering whether the federal agents would move fast enough to save not just her life, but the lives of every Osage in the county. The sound of Ernest stirring beside her made her heart race, but she forced herself to maintain the steady breathing of natural sleep. Because if he woke up and realized she was awake, if he saw the knowledge in her eyes, then Tom White's careful plans would collapse, and Hale's final solution would proceed as scheduled. Outside her window, the mechanical humming from the underground tunnels grew slightly louder, as if the earth itself was building towards some terrible climax. The sound that had been mistaken for oil equipment was actually the noise of explosives being armed, charges being connected, detonators being tested. Somewhere beneath Osage County, William Hale was preparing to write the final chapter of his genocide with enough explosives to level every major building in the area and eliminate every witness to his crimes. The clock on Molly's nightstand showed 4:17 a.m. Dawn was still hours away, but the darkness felt alive with possibility and terror in equal measure. In the tunnels beneath her house, federal agents were photographing evidence that would eventually send multiple men to their deaths. In those same tunnels, Hale's men were making final preparations for mass murder on a scale that America had never seen. The race against time was entering its final phase, and the outcome would determine not just whether justice would be served for the victims who had already died, but whether an entire people would survive to see another sunrise. The whisper of wind through the oil derricks carried the sound of something that might have been prayers, or might have been final goodbyes, as if the prairie itself understood that everything was about to change forever. In a few hours, the sun would rise on either liberation or annihilation, and the choice between those futures rested in the hands of people who had already proven themselves capable of unimaginable evil. But first, Molly Kyle had to survive until federal agents could move without triggering the immediate destruction of everyone she had ever loved. The sound of her own heartbeat seemed deafeningly loud in the darkness, each pulse marking another second closer to either salvation or the final silence that would fall over Osage County like a shroud. Ernest's breathing changed slightly, and Molly felt him shift in his sleep, his hand moving unconsciously toward the nightstand where he kept the arsenic that had been slowly killing her for months. In the distance, barely audible above the mechanical humming from below ground, came the sound of vehicles moving through the darkness without headlights, carrying either federal agents or Hale's men toward a confrontation that would determine the fate of everyone still alive in those blood-soaked Oklahoma oil fields. The final act was beginning, and no one would emerge unchanged from what was about to unfold in the tunnels beneath America's most successful genocide. The question that haunts every survivor of systematic evil isn't whether they could have stopped it. It's whether they would have chosen to profit from it instead. At 5:23 a.m. on March 21, 1926, the mechanical humming beneath Osage County stopped. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of absolute quiet that comes just before thunder. when the air itself holds its breath and waits for the world to split apart. Tom White felt it in his bones as he crouched in the tunnel system beneath William Hale's ranch house, his flashlight beam cutting through darkness that seemed to swallow light like hungry oil. The federal agent had been underground for 6 hours, photographing evidence and mapping explosive placements, when the humming ceased and something far more terrifying began. Footsteps, directly above his head. Not the random movement of someone going about their morning routine. These were measured, deliberate steps that followed a specific pattern. 3 steps forward, pause. 2 steps left, pause, repeat. The sound of someone conducting a final inspection before execution. White pressed himself against the tunnel wall, feeling crude oil seepage soak through his shirt as he listened to William Hale walking the floorboards of his study. Through gaps in the rough planking, he could see slivers of lamplight and occasionally the shadow of a man moving with the methodical precision of someone checking items off a list. But it was the sound that came next that made White's blood freeze in his veins, the unmistakable metallic click of a detonator being armed. Then another, and another. Each click echoing through the tunnel system like the ticking of some massive, malevolent clock counting down to midnight. White realized with growing horror that Hale wasn't just preparing for the spring equinox massacre. He was accelerating his timeline. The final harvest was beginning now. Above ground, emergency signals were already being transmitted to federal agents positioned throughout the county. But the coded messages weren't reaching their intended recipients because Hale's men had spent the pre-dawn hours systematically cutting telegraph wires and disabling radio equipment. The federal investigation team was being isolated and blinded, just as methodically as the Osage had been eliminated over the previous 5 years. Every communication line, every escape route, every potential source of help was being severed with the same cold calculation that had characterized every aspect of Hale's operation. In her bedroom 3 miles away, Molly Kyle felt the change in atmospheric pressure that comes with massive underground explosions being prepared. Her ears popped slightly, and she noticed that the usual sounds of morning birds had been replaced by an unnatural stillness that made her skin crawl with primitive warning signals. Ernest was fully awake now, sitting on the edge of their bed and staring out the window with an expression she had never seen before. Not the nervous anxiety that had characterized his behavior for months, but something approaching relief mixed with anticipation. He looked like a man who had been carrying an unbearable burden and could finally see the end of his suffering. "It's time," he said quietly, though whether he was speaking to her or to himself, Molly couldn't tell. He reached for the bottle of medicine on the nightstand, but his movements were different now. Instead of the careful, almost gentle way he had been administering the arsenic, Ernest handled the bottle with the rough efficiency of someone completing an unpleasant but necessary task. "This will help you feel better," he said, turning toward her with eyes that had gone completely flat and lifeless. "It will help you sleep." Molly realized that the slow poisoning phase of her murder was over. Ernest was preparing to give her a lethal dose, enough arsenic to kill her within minutes rather than months. The pretense of caring for her illness was being abandoned because there was no longer any need to maintain the deception. Whatever was happening this morning was meant to eliminate all witnesses simultaneously. Her individual death would be lost in a much larger catastrophe that would make careful investigation impossible. But as Ernest poured the fatal dose into a glass of water, his hands were shaking so violently that half the liquid spilled onto the floor. The accidental arsenic consumption that had been weakening him for months was finally catching up, and his nervous system was beginning to shut down. The man who had been methodically poisoning his wife was dying from the same substance, and his deteriorating condition was interfering with his to complete her murder. Molly watched him struggle with the medicine bottle. his coordination failing as the cumulative effects of arsenic toxicity overwhelmed his motor functions. This was her opportunity, possibly her last one, to escape before he managed to force the lethal dose down her throat. But escape to where? If Tom White was correct about the scope of Hale's final operation, there might be nowhere in Osage County that wasn't targeted for destruction. The mechanical humming that had stopped might have been the sound of a massive coordinated attack being prepared, something that would eliminate every potential witness in a single morning of carefully orchestrated chaos. The sound that made her decision for her came from outside their bedroom window. Not the explosion she had been expecting, but something far more subtle and infinitely more terrifying. The whisper of wind through structures that were no longer there. Molly pressed her face to the glass and saw something that defied immediate comprehension. The oil derrick that had stood in their front yard for 3 years was gone. Not destroyed by explosion or collapsed from mechanical failure, but simply absent, as if it had never existed. The truth about what happened in Osage County wasn't buried with William Hale's conviction, or silenced by the prison walls that finally contained him. It lived on in the methods he pioneered, the systems he perfected, and the uncomfortable questions his crimes forced America to confront about the price of looking away when evil wears a familiar face. Tom White's investigation didn't just solve a series of murders. It exposed a template for systematic oppression that would be refined and repeated wherever indigenous wealth attracted the attention of people who believed that genocide was simply another business expense. The techniques used against the Osage, the careful cultivation of corruption, the weaponization of trust and intimacy, became the blueprint for countless future atrocities disguised as progress. Today, as we pump oil from lands that still echo with the screams of those who died for their mineral rights, we must ask ourselves the same question that haunted every survivor of the Osage Murders. Not whether we could have stopped it, but whether we would have chosen courage over complicity when the moment of truth arrived. Because somewhere, in ways we might not even recognize, those same choices are still being presented to us every single day.